What's up everyone, I'm Eldridge, and today I'm going to talk about armor in Camelot Unchained and in real life. Furthermore, this is going to be a little bit of a rant about realism. And wait, before you run away because I said the R word, please do hear me out. I'm aware that this is a fantasy game, and as such, realism isn't the overarching thing that needs to govern everything. However, my argument is that realism is important in fantasy games, and we use it a lot. Pretty much every fantasy video game still uses realism in a lot of aspects, and it doesn't do so to be historically accurate or anything like that. Realism is important because it makes us feel connected to this world that is presented to us. This is why, even though we operate in a fantasy world where literally anything could be explained away by magic, we still like to have something as simple as a bow. If you think about it, in a world with magic where people can throw fireballs and there's magical potions, why are people still using bows? It really doesn't make that much sense. Why not instead a repeating crossbow with magical bolts that just replenish themselves? That would be so much better than a bow that you actually have to have arrows for, and then you have to lug the thing around because it's so big. If we're just going to explain everything away with magic, then there is no reason for these things. But we like to have them around anyway because they do fit our vision of a fantasy world, because most people's vision of a fantasy world also has to do with medieval Europe and Robin Hood and King Arthur and all of those things. And when we associate the game with those things in our head, we like certain things to happen in a way that we expect. Because if everything happens in a different way, it freaks us out a little bit. Generally, this has to do with things that we are familiar with. If we have a certain familiarity with a topic, then we subconsciously have a problem when that is being messed with, because it just doesn't compute and it sort of takes us out of the experience, because we're thinking, how is that possible? And this is the basis of my argumentation on armor in Camelot Unchained, because I do happen to have a little bit of knowledge about historical armor. And as such, when that knowledge is being messed with, it completely takes me out of the experience, breaks my immersion, and for lack of a better word, offends my brain. So first of all, I want to explain to all of you how armor works in real life and what's important for it, and then the uncanny valley effect is going to happen to you as well. Isn't that beautiful? You can share my pain. There is a lot to know about armor, but I'm going to boil it down to 5 basic principles that armor simply has to follow. The first basic armor principle is effectiveness. Any given piece of armor used by a soldier has to be effective. It doesn't necessarily have to be impenetrable, but it has to be made for a specific purpose and has to be fit for that purpose. So for example, if a modern soldier is wearing a bulletproof vest, that vest better be bulletproof, because otherwise, what's the point of wearing it? The role of armor throughout history was to protect the wearer. And to ensure that this protection is facilitated, people tried to use the very best material available to them. So for example, once a civilization had access to bronze, they would start using bronze in their armor. Sure, if they were still in the early Bronze Age, bronze armor would be delegated to richer or more important fighters, and less important fighters may still have used other materials. But whatever those other materials were, they were certainly the most efficient materials possible that were not bronze. And as soon as civilizations came into the Iron Age, they pretty much used iron exclusively because it actually turned out to be much easier to produce than bronze. Besides being, of course, a lot stronger and just simply better. Iron phases out bronze. This is simply a universal fact. This has happened in literally every civilization on Earth. One of the more common tropes that has come up in the last century is that of leather armor. Now, don't get me wrong, leather was used by certain civilizations, but generally those civilizations did not have access to bronze. And if they did, they would start using leather in combination with bronze or with iron if they had access to that. For example, a tunic of leather would be covered in bronze or iron rings to increase its effectiveness. But the further along civilizations went, the less they used leather, because as it turns out, leather was actually pretty difficult to get through the ages. But apart from the fact that leather was hard to get, it is also incredibly ineffective as armor. If you put enough layers of leather on top of each other, or you have some really hardly cured leather, yes, that stuff can keep blades from piercing through it for a while and to an extent. But the effort required in boiling this leather to the point where it is that solid is simply not worth it. There is no reason why anyone would wear a material that is heavy but doesn't actually protect them. Just like today, soldiers would not go into combat wearing fat suits, even if they are more easily available than bulletproof vests, because they simply don't offer any protection and would just get them killed, and on top of that they are incredibly heavy and unwieldy. Speaking of heavy and unwieldy, the second basic principle of armor is mobility. Mobility is always the key to victory when foot soldiers engage other foot soldiers. So while maximum protection is desired, mobility must not be compromised in a way that would endanger the wearer. And this is probably one of the biggest myths about armor that has ever been perpetuated by Hollywood, awful shallow history books, in that medieval armor does not turn the wearer into defenseless turtles should they ever be knocked onto their back. And it doesn't require a crane to lift a knight onto his horse. This would only be true if you took someone who has never worked out a single day in their life and put them into a suit of armor because they are simply not trained enough. But then again, you could put a 50-kilogram backpack onto them and they would still collapse, while somebody who is more trained has no problem carrying a 50-kilogram backpack or a 30 to maximum 40-kilogram body armor. Just look at the footage in the background. These guys aren't even all highly trained and fit, but yet they can move in these armors because obviously they have to be able to. The basic rule when it comes to sword fighting and generally melee, a slow soldier is a dead soldier. And as such, compromises in armor design have to be made to facilitate mobility. And this mobility doesn't just have to apply in combat. You also have to think about the fact that a soldier is going to have to carry around his gear most of the time. So even in a world like that of Camelot Unchained, a heavy fighter is going to have to carry his heavy armor around pretty much all day. And when you do carry around that much weight, you are going to make damn sure that every single thing you carry around with yourself is in some point useful. A quasi-modern day example of this would be the paratroopers in World War II. When the American paratroopers of the 82nd and the 101st Divisions were thrown out of airplanes over France during Operation D-Day, they were weighed down with bags upon bags of stuff. Because some higher up general guy thought it would be a really great idea for every paratrooper to be equipped with literally anything he could ever need. But as soon as the paratroopers jumped out of the airplane, they lost half their gear because there was just so much stuff strapped onto them that it ruined aerodynamics. And as soon as they landed, they got rid of even more gear because they just realized it was too heavy and just not useful enough in all of their situations. The third basic principle is simplicity. Now, for most of history, the most important reason for simplicity was that most of your soldiers couldn't even read. So why would you give them highly complex weapons and armor when simpler ones can get the job done as well? And when you have to consider the first two principles, it's obvious why a lot of people step into this trap. Because when your armor has to be effective, but it also has to facilitate mobility, then you tend to over-design and come up with stuff that is just too out of this world for anyone who's going to wear this armor to handle. It's a designer problem of people designing armor that they're never going to have to wear. So what you could say about simplicity, for example, is what you can solve in one layer of armor, don't try to solve in 2 or 3. Because complicated armor is not necessarily better. Throughout history, these simple solutions have generally won out. Chainmail is the very best example of this. For almost 1,500 years of human history, chainmail has dominated the battlefield and was the armor of choice for most people. And the reasons for this are obvious. Chainmail is pretty effective against most infantry-used weapons. It's basically just like wearing a 5 to 10 kilogram shirt, so it really doesn't do much to your mobility. And it's simple, because as I just said, it's a shirt, it's a tunic. You slip into it and that's it. There are no complicated buckles you have to fix or somebody has to fix for you. You slip into your padding, throw the chainmail on top, and you are done. It is also incredibly cheap to maintain. And that is the next basic principle. Armor has to be economically viable. As an example, we have had the technology for bulletproof vests for quite a long time, but it is only in very recent years that normal infantry divisions are being equipped with these. And the reason for that is that bulletproof vests are expensive, and a sad fact of war, life is expendable. This is another reason for chainmail, because chainmail is very easily maintained. You oil that thing up so it doesn't rust, and whenever it takes some damage, it just needs a couple of extra rings to fix it back up. Steel breastplates, on the other hand, for example, once they have been run through with something, that's it. You can take that thing and throw it out, because you're never going to turn that into a solid piece of armor again. And so that's why plate armor took so long to take hold, because it was very, very expensive to make. But if you think about it, the principle of steel plate armor had been around for far longer, because it was used in helmets. Helmets made of steel, iron, or bronze had been in use for thousands of years before that. And the reason for that is very simple. A wound to the arm, you can probably survive. You might even survive having your arm or your leg cut off. But a wound to the head without modern medicine, that's probably going to be fatal. And so the first piece of armor that throughout history everyone got was a helmet, because that was actually life-saving. The next piece of armor would be something to cover the torso, then something to cover the groin area, and only then something to cover the extremities. Doing it the other way around by having armor on your forearms and your legs, that's the LARP way of doing things. And so whatever the best material is that you have, that's generally what you're going to use for the head first. As evidenced by over 1,000 years of people wearing chainmail, but wearing steel plate helmets of various designs. And this is where leather armor comes back into play. I already told you that it is not really all that effective. But the problem with leather is also that it is not economically viable, at least it wasn't for thousands of years. Nowadays, there are so many people in the world and we eat so much damn meat that we have animal hides out the wazoo. We have so many they have to be burned and turned into animal feed because we simply don't know what to do with all of them. But there was a time when most farmers had a handful of animals, and killing more than 1 or 2 a year was pretty much a taboo to most of them. And when you only have 1 or 2 animals to slaughter every year, and you only have your 1 or 2 animal skins, you use that animal skin for something that's really important. Like, I don't know, boots, belts, straps, buckles, things that keeps your clothes in place, things you need around the house. There is just no way that any of those people had access to leather armor. And before you say, oh, but there was leather armor in history, I have proof. I know, but most of that leather armor actually comes from nomadic cultures. Nomadic cultures had a lot more animals than those settled cultures in Europe. And so those nomadic cultures, like the Huns, for example, yes, they did use a lot more leather armor because to them it was economically viable. They had so much of it. But they still didn't use leather in a vacuum. They had vests and tunics that they would cover in metal of any sort. There are very famous pieces, for example, where Chinese coins were sewn onto leather because after ransacking China, the Mongols had so much money from the Chinese that they just took those coins and used them for armor because it was the cheapest thing they had access to. Economics has always played into the materials used, and leather is simply not one of those materials unless you are very specifically talking about nomadic cultures that have a ton of animals around. And the biggest issue with this is leather scale armor. Leather scale armor is entirely a fabrication of modern day LARP suppliers. And the reason for this is that leather is so cheap and can very easily with machines be cut into pieces that look like a scale and sewn together with very little expenditure of labor, but can then be sold at a much higher profit than metal armor can be. Metal armor these days is actually pretty damn expensive because there is just no need for it anymore outside of LARP and reenactment. There's absolutely no point to leather scale armor. It is the worst offender of all of them. Because of the expenditure of labor required to make them without the access to machines, because of their incredibly low effectiveness, which means they are horribly inefficient, and that is the last basic principle. To combine all of this together, armor has to be efficient. I know, big surprise coming from a German. We need the efficiency, yeah? Well, when it comes to armor, we actually do need efficiency because we're trying to equip an entire army with this stuff. It has to be effective, it can't be too heavy, and has to facilitate mobility, it has to be simple, and it has to be economically viable. And when all 4 of these are met, we have ourselves efficient armor. And so now, after all of this, I know it's been a long journey through history, we're going to apply this to Camelot Unchained. Now, I'm not going to talk about light armor, because the light armor that we've been shown is pretty much just robes, and as we know, it is supposed to be for mages, and there really is no real-world equivalent of mages except for religious authorities. And when we look at all of these religious authorities, we can see that they are all wearing very silly pajamas. And so it is absolutely fine that light armor in Camelot Unchained also happens to be very silly pajamas. And the only thing I would ask really of this light armor is that it is thematically fitting to the realm that it belongs to. And I would say yep, and yep. Wonderful. We have established that this armor is fit for purpose. Now let's move on to medium and heavy armor. So the first one we're going to look at is the Arthurian heavy armor. And as we can see, the Arthurian heavy armor is head to toe steel plates. So yeah, that is definitely an effective armor. The vital zones are all covered except for the crotch, but that's a compromise to mobility. This little lamellar skirt in the back is going to cause problems if the wearer tries to run. And so for the sake of mobility, this skirt would usually end at the side of the legs, where it would still cover pretty much the entire front, but the fighter's buttocks would probably be uncovered simply to facilitate movement. Simplicity wise, it's fine. We have a lot of separate parts that are fixed with buckles and straps. It would probably take a while to put this armor on and might require somebody to help you with those pesky buckles in the rear. But all in all, the simplicity is still given because it is one layer of plate armor on pretty much all surfaces. This armor is definitely also economically viable, which is pretty great, because there wasn't a lot of time and energy invested into making it all that fancy. There's some minor ornamentation on the helmet and the breastplate, but that is simply pride in one's work. Beyond that, everything is functional and really does look like working armor. And so this is definitely an efficient set of armor, and if it did have that hole in the back, it's something that I would wear into battle any day. And now we come to the Arthurian medium armor, and while I do appreciate the padded tunic, I'm just not a fan of this armor being entirely leather, especially for the helmet. I think that is just silly. Leather helmets are another one of those things. They are incredibly difficult to make, but they actually don't offer that much protection. If you get pummeled in the head with a hammer, you're still probably gonna be dead. So what is the point really of this helmet? There isn't one. And the rest of the armor is also leather, and so beyond the padded tunic, nothing seems to be that effective really. Mobility-wise, I think this is fine. The tunic could probably use a slit in the front just so that the legs can move a little better. But beyond that, this is definitely not going to slow the wearer down. Now, I will say it is simple enough. There is a lot of ornamentation on the chest plate and on the kneecaps and the upper leg thingies. But if you're gonna spend this much time and effort in making a leather armor, then you might as well make it look fancy. The real problem here is not the ornamentation, it's the leather. Which is why it fails the next category of being economically viable, because it is definitely not. Making all of those hard-boiled leather plates would take an extraordinary amount of work, and it simply doesn't do that much to protect the wearer. Because with the chest just being covered in padded leather or cloth, a good solid sword thrust is gonna go right through that and skewer the guy. And I already said that the helmet doesn't do much either, so this really just looks fancy and doesn't do anything, and as such is simply not efficient armor. Now I think this particular set could be easily fixed by adding a chainmail for the chest to go over the padded armor, as it was intended to be historically, and replacing the silly leather hat with an actual helmet. It doesn't have to be a full-faced, closed helmet, it can be just a kettle helmet or something like that. And now we're gonna look at the Tuatha De Danann heavy armor. And at first glance, you're probably gonna say, oh no, Donkey's gonna hate this one, but you know what? I think this is actually alright. There are some things about this armor I don't like, but at a first glance, it really doesn't offend me that much. So let's look at effectiveness. We have a plated helmet that covers most of the head and face, and we have a plated torso. So far so good, we have covered the 2 prime vitals with the heaviest armor we could find. And then we went one step further and we're also protecting the groin area and part of the leg with this scaled skirt. Now the biggest drawback of this scaled skirt is that it's going to make an absolute racket when you run. But apart from that, it is going to offer very solid protection against a lot of bladed weapons, and that's great. Effectiveness wise, I really think this armor could work. The only big glaring weak point I see is around the neck, and one might think about having a bit of chainmail or just having a rim to the breastplate just to cover that up a tiny little bit more. So if we really just think of the wood as inlays and decoration, then I think that's okay. But that's really about it. Mobility wise, this armor looks just fine. As I said, the scaled skirt is going to make an absolute racket while running. It's going to be really loud and going to go clap, 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 clap. And nothing else here really looks like it will, except for those feathers on the shoulders. Those might hinder your arm movement, they might cut into your arm while you're trying to lift your sword, so that's not really that great, but it is a tiny minor gripe. Now simplicity is of course something entirely different. This armor is not simple at all. But I will say, in a fantasy MMORPG, simplicity is the first thing that I'm personally willing to throw overboard, because there is an argument to be made for the rule of cool, and this does look like a cool set of armor, so I'm not going to complain too much about it. I think if compromises have to be made so that the armor isn't boring, then simplicity is the point where we should start compromising. Economically viable, this armor is certainly not, because of course there is so much intricate stuff going on. And so in total I will definitely say this armor is still efficient. Now the one gripe I do have about this armor is that weird glassy thing that's on the forearm and the knee pad. I absolutely don't understand that. Now if it's a really hard material that's like dragon glass or something, then why isn't it used for the helmet? Why is it used for the forearm where it really doesn't protect anything viable? And if it's not such a great material, then why is it used in the armor at all? In my personal opinion, I think if the glass was replaced with more of the brass-looking armor, I think it would simply look better. I think there's no need to introduce that many elements into an armor, because you just run the risk of overpopulating it and just making it look weird. And I think this is one of those points where the weird level is reached. At least that intricacy was used in a way to make it look cool. Alright then, and now we come to the Tuatha Danann medium armor, and please no leather scales. Why? I'm sorry, but the leather scales ruin this for me. The rest of the armor I actually think is effective, because most of the brown leather stuff just look like they're layered over a light steel armor. And that's fine, because once again that's just decoration. But the leather scales, there is simply no reason for this. And the thing is that the inspiration for this is one of those crappy LARP leather scale armors that I was talking about, that are completely unrealistic, completely ineffective, and it doesn't even look particularly cool. Instead of this leather scale stuff, he could just be wearing shorts and a t-shirt. I mean, I really like this armor, but I think the fact that the scales are leather, just absolutely destroys it for me. If they were more of those cool brassy scales that the heavy armor came with, hey, I'd be all for that. I think that would actually look really good on this set. But the leather scales, just please don't. Please don't do leather scales. Okay, and now we get to the crux of the issue, because originally this was just going to be a video of me complaining about the Viking armor. And when the Viking armor was first shown, I did complain quite a bit about it, but I just don't think I made my arguments as well as I would have liked. And I know this video was ridiculously long, most people have probably tuned out by this point, but I simply had to make my point as specifically as I could. And so first we're going to look at the Viking medium armor, if you can even call it that. Now, this simply isn't effective. This is not effective armor. Originally, my big complaint about this was the bones, because I'm sorry, I just can't take bone armor seriously. When I hear and see bone armor, I think of these clowns. I'm sorry, but it's just not something I can suspend my disbelief on. It's just silly. And the argument Mark Jacobs gave for the bone armor is that the Viking leader was a grand dragon slayer, and these are dragon bones and such and so forth. But then my question is, What's with all the human imagery? Because there are human skulls on the boots, there are human-ish kind of skulls on the knee pads, there are ape skulls on the shoulder pads, and there is a human rib cage complete with shoulder blades for the chest armor. How does that have anything to do with dragon slaying? The only thing about this armor that screams dragon slaying to me is the teeny tiny baby dragon on the helmet. And I'm sorry, I just don't think slaying baby dragons is that heroic or awesome, especially if the baby dragon is as big as a cat. And even if I could see past the silly human skeleton imagery that is so spooky and scary, it is still completely ineffective armor, because there are so many gaps between those bones that you can just poke your sword straight through, and underneath is just a tunic of sewn together leather bits and pieces. It is simply entirely ineffective. Mobility-wise, it's fine, because it's not real armor. It's somebody wearing a bunch of leather and bones to the next Kiss concert. Obviously, it's not going to do that much to the mobility, but it definitely does more to your mobility than it should with the level of protection it's going to offer, which is pretty much close to zero. It's not even a simplistic piece of armor. There's so much going on here. We have the bones on the chest, we have tiny little bones around the leather helmet once again. Then there's chainmail around the leather helmet. Why, I don't know, because you're still dead when somebody smacks you over the head with a hammer. Then there's tiny dragon scales on the shoulder to once again facilitate that if you move your arms, you cut yourself on them. There's what I presume are dragon scales to cover the butt. I don't know why, because if dragon scales are really that efficient in keeping you alive, why are you not making helmets and breastplates out of them? There's inexplicable little pieces of chainmail dangling from your knees. And then there's what I can only describe as dragon finger bones on the upper legs. There is no simplicity here. It's a bunch of cool looking things, and I really put that into parentheses because I just... But simple, it is absolutely not. Economically viable? I don't know, that depends on how easily you can get your hands on dragon bones. But even then, because it is so incredibly ineffective, I just don't see why anyone would pay the money that is required for this in order to receive absolutely nothing in return. And so no big surprise, this is not efficient armor. This isn't even armor. This is less armor than the medium Arthurian armor. Even if they are magical, awesome dragon bones that are harder than tungsten steel, there are still huge gaps in between the silly human imagery ribs that are just going to get the wearer of this killed. There's nothing at all covering this guy's belly. This is just as silly as boob plate because it goes against everything that armor is supposed to be. And listen guys, I'm super happy you got rid of boob plates and midriff-free armor because yes, all of that is crap. But the reason you should get rid of those things are not necessarily because sexism. You should get rid of them because they are entirely unrealistic and it makes no sense to run around that way. Because if I told you, why can't my archer shoot an arrow to the moon? You're going to say, well, because gravity. And if you say, why can't I cover myself in a silly human imagery skeleton? Then I'm going to say, well, because armor physics. But it gets even worse. Now let's talk about the heavy Viking armor. Now I'm going to warn you ahead of time, there is not a single thing I like about the Viking heavy armor. So let's talk about effectiveness. It's definitely not effective. We're once again having a leather helmet and a leather scale chest plate. Ugh. Then we have something I can't even identify on the legs, and then this and that. It's really not effective armor. It protects the arms and legs, but the chest and head are pretty much the worst armor you can get. So, no. Mobility-wise, this also fails, because there is so much stuff on this person. They're going to be weighed down more than if they had worn a full plate armor, because there's simply so much dangly nonsense going on everywhere, and because none of it is effective, there's no reason to carry around that much ballast. Simplicity? Are you kidding me? Just look at it, there is nothing simple about it. It's made up of so many different pieces that it is just... If you laid all of these bits and pieces out on a bed and told somebody this is what you're going to wear today, they'd have a very fun time trying to figure out where all of those pieces go. Economically viable, it might actually be because all of this looks like it came from a dumpster. So yeah, maybe it is economically viable in relation to that, but I'm still going to say it's not economically viable because none of these armor pieces make any sense. Once again, if the dragon scales are such great armor in this universe, why aren't people making chest plates and helmets out of them? Why are they still making chest plates out of crappy leather scales, if dragon scales are so much better? So obviously this armor is not efficient whatsoever, and in fact, it is probably the perfect example of how armor should not be done, because it ticks all the boxes of complete faux pas. And so I'm going to say it, this is not armor. This is what somebody wears to a LARP, to look cool. This is in fact an abomination unto noggin. Let's count the different materials used in this set of armor, shall we? So first off, we have leather, which is used in the helmet and the chest plate, because obviously our vitals are our least important places, so we don't need to cover them in anything heavier than leather. Next we have chainmail made of huge rings, which is used on the shoulders. I'm not entirely sure why, because this also means there has to be a bunch of stuff underneath for the chainmail to actually have that form. And so if it's leather, then once again, why are we using so much leather? And if it's steel underneath, then why are the chains on top? Next we have some actual bits of plate armor covering the upper arm, the elbow, the back of the hand, the knee, and the top of the foot. Because seeing how we have access to steel plate armor, and it even looks like pretty civilized, high-tech steel plate armor, we are using them to cover the least important things of our body, of course. Then we have the dragon scales. Why are we using them to cover our arms? I mean, they have spiky bits that it's gonna make them awkward using with a shield. You're gonna get stuck everywhere. You're gonna pull people's clothes off when you accidentally tug at them. And then we have these inexplicable flaps of chainmail. And I really want to show you this in the other picture. Look at how frayed this chainmail is. They can't follow a damn pattern of chainmail for more than a few rows before they get bored and go, I must kill somebody because I'm a Viking. The chainmail looks like it was made by an arthritic gibbon with ADHD, and yet the leather scale armor is a perfectly symmetrical work of geometric splendor. Look at this leather scale armor, how perfectly all the scales are shaped and boiled to be in a specific geometric shape. And look how intricate the armor plating on the arms is. There's little decorations on it. Your civilization can do that, but they can't make a decent chainmail? And this is true for the shoulders as well, by the way. Look at how big those rings are. It's really not that difficult to keep a pattern when you're using rings that big. But still there are gaping holes. And if that is supposed to be battle damage, why has nobody ever repaired it? In fact, why is this entire armor in such a state of disrepair? Everything has chips and looks broken and old and dusty. It's like nobody in the Viking realm has any pride of ownership. Okay, this is just on the render, but what's with this rawhide flap on your butt? This attire, dear Viking, clearly has bits and pieces suggesting at least classical or dark age level of technology. And still you just felt compelled to use a flap of ugly rawhide to do what precisely? Cover your butt? I mean, seriously, there is no point to this flap whatsoever. Why does it look so awful? If it's supposed to be decorative, well, it certainly looks like Mad Max and the Stone Age had a baby. But anyway, we're not yet done counting, because there's another inexplicable piece of, I don't even know what this armor is supposed to be, on the upper leg. I honestly don't know what this is good for. I don't know what it is made of. It just looks weird, but I do know it's different material from the rest of the armor, so we have a sixth material. But that's not where it ends, because we have one other piece of armor, and that is the only actual piece of historical armor on this entire outfit. Splint armor on the legs and the arms. Now that is definitely something that was used during the Dark Ages, because it was very simple to produce and offered great protection on all the places where the chainmail wasn't. So there we go, we have 7 different types of armor in one armor set. And I really have to say, this totally reminds me of the Outland clown suit. That is the first thing I thought about when I saw this armor. It looks completely mismatched and random. There is no coherency to any of this. Are the Vikings in this universe not civilized and settled? Are they nomadic barbarians? Don't they have decent foraging techniques? Well, no, because then we get this picture of some Viking swords, and these perfectly tooled and forged Dark Age era longswords that look eerily like these here suggests that the Vikings can indeed produce decent battle gear in this universe. So they have blacksmiths, or whatever the crafters are going to be called in this universe with the vox and everything, that can make really good swords, but they can only make this sort of mismatched nonsense armor? Why? That's my real problem with this. There is such a jump in logic here. On the one side we have post-apocalyptic dark ages, ooh, watch out and dress yourself like you fell out of a dumpster. But on the other hand we have absolutely historical and beautiful symmetrical swords. And I'm really sorry I have to be this critical of the armor, but I really hate it. I hate this Viking armor so much that I have decided for myself, if this is what I can expect, I am not going to play Vikings in Camelot Unchained ever. Because even if you introduce some elements that are more historical, that's not my problem. I care about this mismatched nonsense that's going on. This doesn't look like civilized armor. I'm still gonna have to watch everyone else run around like a Mad Max character, and honestly, I would rather be killing those silly dudes. But just like with the Empath, I thought it was important to at least give a counterexample of what I think good armor would be for the Vikings. And so I came up with this. Now listen, I'm not an artist, okay, so this is just a Photoshop together mess. But it does fix all the problems that I have. And it still keeps them in a very fantasy Viking way that they obviously were never in history. So I've used some chainmail to protect the body and a plate helmet to protect the head. And then we have shoulders. We don't know what material they are because they are covered in fur. And I think if you really want to give them the savage feel, work more with fur. You can cover stuff up. It doesn't matter what's underneath if it's covered in fur. And it's going to give them that Viking look without making them look like dumpster diving hobos. I extended the plate armor pieces over the entire arm. That still kind of breaks some rules, but the biggest problem with this armor set was definitely all the different things that were going on. I replaced the silly chain flaps with a decorative flap with some runic script, because runic script always immediately makes things look much more Viking. And then I kept the splint armor on the legs, and the only thing I did to the legs is cover up that nonsensical chainmail that is there for some reason. Seriously, that chainmail on the legs makes absolutely no sense. And then I also covered up whatever that was on the upper legs. It's just uninteresting and not needed. Now this is how I would like the Vikings to look, because this still has a savage feel to it, but it also still looks like a relatively civilized people who understand armor, who understand the principles behind forging materials and economical viability. Right, whew, that's me done. And so I thought it was fairer to go through all the armor and give some history, because maybe that's even interesting to some of you guys, who knows? And if you are actually still watching at this point, I would like you to write a comment that says snickerdoodle or includes snickerdoodle somewhere in the comment that you were gonna write anyway. That way I will know you're one of the glorious people who appreciates my work enough to watch it in its entirety. But until then, I've been the Cloaking Donkey, and I'll see you in another video.